So I want to turn our attention to today's program, which I'm really excited about, Painting a Portrait, Growing a Legacy, Interpreting the Life of Juliette Gordon Low. Our speaker today is Lisa Junkin Lopez. Lisa is the executive director of the Juliette Gordon Low Birthplace. The Birthplace is considered by most as the front door of the Girl Scout movement. And since getting there, Lisa's been working to further align the Birthplace with the Girl Scouts' mission to build girls of courage, confidence, and character who make the world a better place. She's leading the Birthplace through a period of programmatic and operational change that positions the girls at the center of the site's activities. Prior to coming to Savannah, Lisa provided vision and leadership at the Jane Addams Hull-House Museum at the University of Illinois at Chicago, which has been internationally recognized for tackling contemporary social issues through innovative exhibitions, programs, and tours. Lisa regularly speaks and publishes about socially engaged museums and has served on the board of editors of the Public Historian, as a faculty member of Museum and Exhibition Studies at the University of Illinois at Chicago. She was a fellow at the Institute for Research on Race and Public Policy and winner of the Association of Midwest Museums Promising Leadership Award. Lisa holds a master's degree in art education from the School of Art Institute of Chicago and a bachelor's degree in art history from the College of William and Mary. So with that, I'll turn it over to Lisa.
Luciana, thank you so much for the opportunity to present, and thank you all for being here. It's so nice to see a full room. I've got my phone here. It's because I don't want to run over time, so I've got a little stopwatch out, and that's what that is. And I want to begin by acknowledging the many scholars and museum leaders who've come before me, whose work lays a foundation for our understanding of Juliette Gordon Low that we build upon today. That includes Stacy Cordery, who's written the most thoughtful, in-depth biography of Juliette Gordon Low to date. If you're interested in this topic, pick up that book. I would like to thank my predecessors at the Juliette Gordon Low Birthplace, including Fran Harold and Catherine Kina, who loved Juliette Gordon Low and knew how much she means to our movement. I also want to thank Cindy Malinick, who opened doors at Girl Scouts for examining the life of Juliette Low in context of the larger arc of the Girl Scout movement, which we'll be discussing. I also want to thank descendants of Juliette Gordon Low's family, whom we work closely with, and who keep their great aunt's memory alive in their hearts. Finally, I want to thank my talented colleagues at the Birthplace, who I work very closely with, and in the Cultural Assets Department at Girl Scouts of the USA. These women and men are the very best Girl Scouts I know, and they work every single day to further the legacy of Juliette Low. So as director of the Juliette Gordon Low Birthplace for the last 4 years, I've spent countless hours reading, thinking, talking about the life of Juliette Gordon Low. To be clear, I'm not a scholar of her life, but I lead an incredible team of educators and interpreters whose job it is to tell visitors about the life of Juliette Low and her legacy through daily tours and programs. I've been working in women's history museums for more than 12 years, as Luciana discussed, writing educational programs and giving talks much like this one. So when, as was the case for this talk, I'm asked to speak on the life and legacy of Juliette Gordon Low, it would seem to be a simple task. And yet, I think it's fair to say that to know a life, right, to really make it known and therefore make it understood is a tall order, if perhaps not an impossible challenge. And at the same time, that's exactly what we're tasked with day in and day out at her birthplace, the Juliette Gordon Low Birthplace, as we engage hundreds of visitors wanting to know more about this remarkable woman and the movement she founded. As visitors to the Birthplace walk through the home on their tour, they encounter 3 portrait paintings of our namesake and founder of Girl Scouts. It's a fitting way to look at a woman whom you'll see was an accomplished artist herself. Each of the portraits of Juliette Low is striking, well composed, a window to the subject within, and each leaves an impression on the visitor. But when each of the images is so dramatically different from the next, one wouldn't be faulted for thinking that the subjects were different women entirely. So as we attempt to understand the life of Juliette Gordon Low today, let us begin by looking deeply at each of these portraits and asking ourselves what they communicate about their subject, as well as what assumptions they might reinforce, and perhaps even what they might obscure. Let's also consider the pictures that are most often painted of Juliette Low through narrative, and consider how to peel back the layers to try to locate the woman behind them. Only then, I believe, will we understand what Juliette's life truly has to offer, to us here in this room, to all those who visit her birthplace, to the larger story of women's history, and to the Girl Scout movement, including the millions of girls who inherit the legacy of Juliette Low today. Part 1, Daisy. Let's begin with this portrait by Edward Hughes, which hangs in the National Portrait Gallery and a very excellent copy in the Birthplace's dining room. It's one of the most familiar images of our subject. It also represents, at least to me, some of the most commonly told narratives of our life, which I'd like to share with you. Let's look at the painting first. The subject is perched at the edge of a piazza, a dramatic southern landscape in the background. She is a petite, pale woman with rosy cheeks and chestnut-colored hair. Her dress is exquisite. Pink stripes, florals, gauze, and lace are carefully composed to frame her torso and accentuate her shoulders and her tiny waist, and then cascade down like waterfalls to the floor with a white puff of an ostrich feather fan held at the knee. She was born on October 31st, 1860, as Juliette McGill Kinsey Gordon. All family names, though friends and family called her Daisy throughout her life. In addition to inheriting the names of her family before her, Daisy inherited her family's wealth and elite social standing, which this painting, its composition, the setting, and the subject's apparel all reinforce. Daisy's parents were William Washington Gordon II and Eleanor Kinsey Gordon, and she was the second of 6 children. Her mother, Nellie, was a hugely charismatic, strong woman, much like her mother before her. Her father, William Washington Gordon II, was a cotton and rice broker and served in the Confederate Army during the Civil War, while her mother's brothers fought for the Union Army. Census data reveals that 21 people were enslaved by the Gordon family in the year of Daisy's birth. And it's clear that all of the Gordon family's privileges were gained through the institution of slavery, though this in itself is not a story that has always been told. Despite facing challenges during the Civil War, Daisy appears to have enjoyed a loving family and a happy childhood. All accounts of Daisy's life are filled with the humorous antics of a woman who, from the start, showed a zest for life, a loving and helpful, if sometimes stubborn, spirit, and an unusual, though captivating, sense of humor. These are some of the most memorable stories of Daisy's life. As a child, her sense of empathy sometimes got her into trouble. For example, when her mother discovered the guest room blankets were trampled in mud, having been stolen by Daisy to keep the family cow warm at night. She was very worried about that cow. In a story that I find less amusing, Daisy once convinced her friends to start a helpful hands club, and they decided that their first project would be to sew clothes for an immigrant family, Italian immigrant family that sold fruit. But she wasn't concerned by the fact that she and her friends didn't know how to sew, and they delivered clothes that fell apart in public when the boys wore them, which must have been terribly embarrassing. For these antics and dozens more, seriously, there are dozens more, she was called Crazy Daisy by her relatives. She may have leaned into this nickname. Her brother described her as having extraordinary intuition but very little logic. The antics continue well into her adulthood, where she continued to have an outrageous sense of humor and the confidence to act childlike and free, whether it was standing on her head in Girl Scouts board meetings to reveal the shoes being considered for uniform, or sliding down the banister in her childhood home and the birthplace. But it wasn't all laughs for Daisy. Look again at the portrait. Daisy looks out at us with a peculiar expression that beguiles our visitors to the birthplace, and each come with their own interpretation. Some say she looks placid, some say unsure, some say perhaps sad or bored. They ask, was she tired of sitting so long for the portrait artist, Edward Hughes? Or could she have been bored of her elite Southern life? In 1887, at the time the portrait was made, Daisy was newly married to a wealthy Englishman, the blustery William Mackay Low, called Willie. Her new husband was the sole heir to his father's fortune in cotton trading and didn't need to work for a living. The couple spent a good deal of time among the aristocracy in England, enjoying hunting parties, dancing, and presentations at court. However, he was highly destructive, prone to drink and gamble. He engaged in extramarital affairs to the point of being seen openly among friends with his mistress, Anna Bateman. At the same time, Daisy was often ill and struggled with her hearing, which was a frequent source of agony in her life and perhaps an additional challenge in her marriage. She had hearing issues since she was little, and in a story nearly too coincidental to believe, but it's true, a grain of good luck rice thrown at her wedding became lodged in her ear and horribly infected on her honeymoon. She was unhappily childless in a bitterly disappointing marriage. In the end, she felt she must divorce Willie, and was in process when he died of a stroke in 1905, leaving her widowed, yet free to control her destiny. Daisy never married again. She surrounded herself with friends and not a few pets, traveled when she could, and nurtured the lives of younger women. She traveled to places like Egypt and India, though to the extent possible, she traveled in luxury, choosing largely to remain among a network of military contacts. She once remarked that polo games were her favorite part of visiting India. As the story goes, a fated meeting with Sir Robert Baden-Powell, British war hero, changed her life's trajectory. He had recently founded Boy Scouts, which taught military preparedness, citizenship, and fun to more than 40,000 boys by 1911. Daisy was hooked. Drawn to Baden-Powell's charisma and inspired by his work with boys, she had begun to open a new door to her purpose. While staying in rural Scotland, she formed her own group of Girl Guides, citing the fact that thousands of girls had attempted to register for Boy Scouts, though they were denied from the start. Robert Baden-Powell's sister, Agnes, had started Girl Guide troops in order to address this issue, and Daisy followed suit. Daisy's troop camped. They learned first aid and personal hygiene. They were taught to raise chickens and spin wool to sell for funds. With Agnes, Daisy, and other supportive women, girl guiding was taking off through the UK and beyond. Daisy decided to take the effort to the United States and founded the first American troop in 1912 in her hometown of Savannah, Georgia. It was to become her life's greatest accomplishment. So I'm going to say something very unpopular now, which is that although this is a very fine piece of art, it is my least favorite portrait of Daisy. To me, the image of her in a gorgeous gown and the narrative that tends to surround it of a quirky and nearly tragic life can make her seem too frivolous, too flat, like a paper doll. To me, this portrait is something like the Crazy Daisy moniker, in that when it's foregrounded, it serves to diminish Daisy's life story, as well as her accomplishments, because it makes it seem like she may have floundered into Girl Scouts, just in the way that she floundered into the Helpless Hands Club. Sometimes when her story's told, it feels as if life happened to her instead of by her. And I think when any woman's life is discussed in this light, we have to question whether we're getting the whole story. When I look at this image, I wonder, did Daisy recognize her younger self in a pink corseted dress after founding Girl Scouts? And what does this image tell girls who arrive at our doorstep looking to find inspiration in Juliettes and Daisy's story? An interlude. Girl Scouts themselves often talk about traveling to the birthplace as a kind of pilgrimage and a foundational experience in a girl's life. We see girls who are giddy with excitement before entering the front doors, and more than one elder has kissed the sidewalk upon her arrival, declaring her visit to the birthplace was on her bucket list. Visiting the birthplace represents a homecoming for our Girl Scout movement's 2.6 million active members and a gathering space to reflect on our history and build strength for the future. Girls who visit the birthplace bring big expectations. In the visitor evaluation that I conducted when I first came to the birthplace, we confirmed that Girl Scouts view their visit as a chance to feel a personal sense of connection with their founder, with the movement she started, and with the values and principles of Girl Scouting. It's remarkable to come out to the sidewalk in the mornings and talk with as many as 100 girls lined up for their visit. They tell us, "We're coming to be inspired," and Juliette Low changed the world. We want to learn how to change the world too. As much as I love and revere the enthusiasm that Girl Scouts bring to the birthplace, I also feel the burden of responsibility. As an audience-centered museum, we have an obligation to meet the expectations of girls and others looking to be inspired and empowered by Juliette's life. But have our visitors placed Juliette Gordon Low on a pedestal? Can she ever fully live up to their expectations or ours? The truth is that, whether narrated in children's books or around campfires, Juliette Low's life is often described in a fairly simple way, focusing on her successes, glossing over her failures, toward a linear narrative of triumph over hardship. Our manager of tours and education has said, quote, "It's an easy pleasure for tour guides to share tales of Juliette's talents, childhood adventures, and remarkable achievements. But as public historians, we also have an opportunity to tell a fulsome narrative of Juliette Low's life, which may mean complicating her life story in ways that challenge our audience's perceptions and their expectations." In a TED Talk that has now been viewed more than 18 million times, writer Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie spoke of the danger of a single story and how a story told from only one perspective creates stereotypes. The problem with stereotypes, she says, is not only that they're untrue, but that they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story. In a time when pedestals lifting up our nation's leaders are literally, figuratively crashing down as the public demands new interpretations of history and power, there's a new appetite for reckoning with history and reframing beloved historical figures. For public historians and museum workers, this moment is laden with possibility and responsibility. Our work is under a microscope as never before, and our role in providing insight into American life and history is perhaps more valuable than ever. Given our work with children at the birthplace, I'm sometimes asked how one can bring appropriate nuance to historical narratives, and whether it might be sometimes inappropriate to expose children to what may be difficult truths. My response is that we can find age-appropriate ways to have nuanced conversations and prepare parents and caregivers for challenging topics, but it is essential that we do this work. Our girls deserve a fuller story. Adichie is clear on this as well, noting that her own childhood suffered from reading children's books that were only about life in England and not about her home country in Nigeria. She didn't know until she was older that books could represent experiences similar to her own. And in this light, she states how impressionable and vulnerable we are in the face of a story, particularly as children. So our task at the birthplace, whether we're engaging girls or adults, is to add texture to the story of Juliette Gordon Low, to embrace nuance, to share stories with many threads, all the while holding tightly to our central charge to inspire and empower girls on their path to becoming tomorrow's leaders. So we need another image. We need another story. Part 2, Juliette. I always make a point of directing visitors to this portrait of Juliette Gordon Low. In fact, I tend to go on and on. Look at what a different picture it paints from the one downstairs, I say, referring to the Hughes portrait. Here, she's actively involved in a creative pursuit, sculpting clay of the bust of a young girl, not sitting passively in a corseted dress that must have been tight to breathe in. Juliette, let's try calling her by her given name this time, is of course a much older woman by now and has accomplished a great deal. She is a decade into the project of Girl Scouts by the 1920s when this image was created, but she still makes time for her creative pursuits. Juliette is represented here as a talented artist, perfecting her craft and studious in this pursuit. And she was talented. An arts lover from a young age, Juliette graced the stage of the Savannah Theater as a child in a production of A Midsummer Night's Dream, and as a young adult, she cultivated a robust art practice that she returned to at several points later in her life. While some of her artwork, such as china painting, might be considered traditionally feminine, as was appropriate given her gender and her social standing, she also dabbled in metalwork, at which point, as the story goes, her biceps grew too large for her party gowns. Girl Scouts collection demonstrates the excellence of her work. Here is a very fine copy that she made of a painting of her mother, Nellie Kinsey Gordon. A bust of her father that I'm terribly fond of shows her remarkable talent in 3 dimensions. And here's a metal gate that she embellished, all that fancy work, with copper. It was made by her for her home in Wellsburn. This is a pencil sketch of the portrait I showed you. This portrait doesn't resemble, to me, the frivolous woman in the pink dress. Look at her in a simple blouse, her sleeves rolled up, and her hair loose. I always remark on her very open collar, and I note that the image reads to me as quite modern. I think I remark on the blouse because it feels intimate, like we're seeing a version of Juliette that hasn't been revealed to everyone, but rather to those closest to her. And indeed, this portrait was painted by a family member and another woman, Alice Parker Hoyt Shirtliff, who was Juliette's niece, and was named after Juliette's sister, who died at age 17. And the girl who Juliette is sculpting is Alice's daughter, Constance. Does the artist's close familial relationship with Juliette allow her art to convey a greater truth about Juliette's character? I'm not sure, but the painting does speak to a quality that I believe Juliette held, which is that the seriousness and dedication that she demonstrated in her art practice was a trait that she likewise applied to everything in her life. And just as she found success in her artwork, I believe she likewise actively sculpted her life with a greater amount of agency than is apparent in the Hughes portrait, or in the beloved but zany stories that have been told most frequently about her eccentric ways. Look, for example, at the agency she appears to have displayed in relation to her health and hearing. As a child, Juliette experienced ear infections for years that would cause temporary hearing loss. In 1885, the year before she was married, she took herself to the doctor for an experimental treatment of silver nitrate, which ultimately did significant additional damage to her bad ear. While the treatment was ineffective, it appears from family letters that she may have requested it herself after reading success stories in New York. And even if it was the doctor's recommendation, it's notable that she researched and sought treatment throughout her life for this and other ailments. Let's also look at the founding of Girl Scouts as something that she didn't just blunder into, but that came about as a series of thoughtful decisions and leveraging of Juliette's skills, talents, and social networks. There is often a sense in the narratives presented about Juliette that she was just crazy enough to found Girl Scouts. In other words, that her eccentric way in the world allowed her to have an unconventional and ultimately successful idea. Certainly, it was a chance meeting with the famed war hero and founder of Boy Scouts, Robert Baden-Powell, that captured her imagination and ultimately led to the founding of Girl Scouts in the USA. But everything that happened after that occurred because Juliette recognized an opportunity and seized it. She leveraged all the resources at her disposal, including her skills, her wealth, her networks, sculpting them like clay to create her life's greatest work. It is a little-known fact that Juliette's organization wasn't the only scouting organization for girls in the United States at that time, but it is the only one that survived the test of time, in part due to Juliette's leadership ability. Not only did she understand several critically important needs for American girls at the turn of the century, to be challenged and allowed to discover their purpose while remaining in a safe, all-girl environment with adult mentors, but she knew how to galvanize both girls and adult allies to build her organization in its vulnerable, formative years. Perhaps one of her best qualities was her ability to share and collaborate with other women, giving over authority and drawing on the skills and talents of others. Not every founder has this ability. Some of the women she collaborated with in the earliest days of Girl Scouts had a massive influence on the direction of the organization. When Juliette decided to organize a Girl Scout troop in Savannah in 1912, she knew her cousin, Nina Pape, would be her very first call, and their supposed conversation has been immortalized. "Come right over. I've got something for the girls of Savannah, America, and all the world, and we're going to start it tonight." Nina Pape was the headmistress of a Savannah girls' school that was heavily influenced by the progressive education movement at the turn of the 20th century. Nina encouraged creativity and play over rote memorization at her school, and she taught her students how to think, not what to think. Her students took trips abroad, learned folk dancing, and played basketball. 18 girls from the Pape School formed the first official Girl Scout troop, and with that, the bedrock of Girl Scouts pedagogy was solidified. This is just one example of many, but Juliette continued to work with forward-thinking progressive reformers who held different skills and broader perspectives than she, who imbued Girl Scouts with many of the values and frameworks that are still held dearly in the organization today. So by adding nuance to our story and looking at Juliette as the sculptor of her own life, I think a stronger image quickly emerges. At the same time, if we take this route in ascribing her some control over her life, then I think we also must entertain the possibility that she bears responsibility for areas in her life that we may see as shortcomings today. I'll share just one example that we've grappled with at the Birthplace, which is Juliette Low's thinking on race. Given the Girl Scout movement's tremendous commitment to inclusion today, in addition to the overall progressive thrust of the early Girl Scout movement, it doesn't surprise me that many people assume Juliette was a progressive on matters of race in her lifetime, welcoming African American troops to the new organization, just as we know she did for Jewish girls, immigrants, orphans, and girls with disabilities. However, the reality is that Juliette herself was not a champion of African American girls. Personal writings from 1908 demonstrate, for example, that Juliette did not understand African Americans to be equal to white people. The first troop register on the screen here, which is one of the most significant artifacts at the Birthplace, indicates the breadth of girls who participated in the early years of Girl Scouts. But to our knowledge, no African American names are included. Frequently, we come across the story that Juliette's black maid started a troop for girls in her kitchen. Unfortunately, we're unable to confirm this through historic research and analysis. When faced with the decision of whether to admit African American girls to Girl Scouting, Juliette Low's decision as the founder was that the councils needed to decide at a local level, which I read as a strategy to avoid making a highly polarizing decision at a national level. So while in some ways Juliette Gordon Low was a forward-thinking woman, it is unsurprising that she was not able to transcend her family background on this issue. This may be tremendously disappointing news to some who see Juliette Low as a visionary thinker. To others, it may be no surprise at all that she had internalized racism, given her family's significant experience as slave owners and her own upbringing in a white elite in the Reconstruction era South. To imagine Juliette as an anti-racist may be to wish her out of her time and context. As a point of fact, her thinking on race resembles that of many prominent white suffragists of her time, who opted to leave African American women behind in their cause, not because they were blind to matters of race, but because they saw a winning strategy in marginalizing women of color in order to advance their cause for white women. As the suffrage centennial begins, there have been many calls to celebrate the accomplishments of suffrage reformers while also shedding light on their failures. This is not only a balanced approach to interpreting the history of suffrage, but it opens new opportunities to acknowledge and champion the work carried on by women reformers of color who fought for a true universal suffrage. Likewise, though aspects of Juliette's life may surprise or disappoint us, it's critically important that we discuss openly these complexities so that we can all learn from them, and open space within the storyline for an expanded interpretation, which we can't do if we flatten her into a more digestible image. Part 3, Founder. Here is yet another image. This is perhaps the one we are proudest of, the image that represents the woman Juliette Low would become, our founder. Now let's make the shift to referring to her as such as we look at this portrait. Although it's notable that she never painted her own self-portrait, Girl Scouts founder commissioned Belgian artist Alfred Jonieux to paint this portrait of herself in Girl Scout uniform. In her will, she bequeathed the painting to Girl Scouts and hung it for many years in the boardroom at New York headquarters before coming to the birthplace. The image represents all that Girl Scouts aspire to. At Girl Scouts, we proudly state that our movement builds girls, go-getters, innovators, risk-takers, and leaders. This is the Girl Scout DNA, and by that token, our founder is the original GIRL. Girls and troop leaders respond strongly to this image, noting that when compared to the Hughes portrait, she appears confident, assertive, like a leader, proudly wearing her uniform and perhaps addressing the next generation of girls. Our founder is certainly older and wiser than she was in the Hughes portrait as a new bride. Her blouse is still open at the collar, I'll note, and there's no corset here. And she still looks at us, I think, in a somewhat quizzical way. But girls often say she looks confident, as if she's found her purpose. Indeed, she did become a confident, purpose-driven leader of an organization that has influenced millions of girls and women throughout the world. At age 51, our founder's life was forever transformed by the founding of Girl Scouts. When she started a group of 18 girls in Savannah, it has grown into 2.6 million active members today and well over 50 million alumni. More than half of the female entrepreneurs and business owners in the United States and 73% of current female senators are Girl Scout alums. Girl Scouts help to define American girlhood, changing limitations and stereotypes, and preparing girls for leadership for over a century. Girl Scouts' impact is not only national, but global. The earliest years of Girl Scouting prompted an immense and important question. What was the organization's role in the face of a massive worldwide conflict, World War I? Indeed, what role could girls have to play? Our founder answered in the affirmative. Girl Scouts would work to assist war victims and refugees with food and supplies, sell Liberty bonds, serve as government messengers, drive ambulances for the Red Cross, and grow victory gardens in support of the war effort. After the war, she and other leaders sought to create an international council of Girl Guides and Girl Scouts, believing that an international alliance would help to bring about a lasting peace. That's quite a goal. And as a result, today, more than 10 million girls in 150 countries are currently working to better our world through Girl Scouting and Girl Guiding. So in many ways, our founder's life story does end triumphantly. She writes, "When I started, I was for 2 years almost alone. I had to use the tools that were in my hand. And in spite of my shortcomings, we have grown and flourished." And she also said it was because of the girls that this organization has been so successful. But I think we have to acknowledge that this too presents ultimately a flattened image of our founder, telling a linear story of triumph over life's challenges, and in this case, ignoring her flaws or mistakes altogether. As powerful as this image is, it too belies other truths, including that of the young Daisy who struggled with personal challenges, and the serious, resourceful, but flawed Juliette who, like all of us, lived a life of great complexity. At Juliette Low's Birthplace, we are taking steps to tell broader stories, both for the sake of painting a more detailed picture and ultimately toward driving Girl Scouts' mission forward and engaging a new generation of girls. Coda. The 3 portraits of Juliette Low discussed today have become the anchor of one of our most popular programs for Girl Scouts called Be True to Your Selfie. It prompts deep looking at each of the portraits during the tour, encouraging reflection on the complexities of Juliette's life. After the tour, girls then turn a mirror on themselves, reflecting on their strengths, weaknesses, goals, and dreams. The girls make a collaged self-portrait, which we call an inner selfie, or a symbolic image detailing how they want the world to see them. To encourage a diversity of possibilities, we view a number of self-portraits by women artists as inspiration, considering the agency that women have to represent themselves. We're expanding Juliette's story in other ways as well. We're talking about race, for example, identifying her family as slaveholders and acknowledging that it wasn't until at least 1917 when African American girls were welcomed into the Girl Scout movement. We've held several facilitated dialogue programs on sensitive issues such as these at the Birthplace and at Girl Scout Convention. We've digitized and made public archival materials that have never been available before. And we've engaged African American historians and storytellers like Pat Gunn, pictured here, to broaden our story. This work is both challenging and deeply fulfilling, as it opens a conversation with Girl Scout members about our history and considers our responsibilities for shaping its future. We're also talking much more about disability. A new initiative at the Birthplace called Access for All is rooted in the history of Juliette Gordon Low being hard of hearing, using this history as a launch pad to improve our own ability to serve Girl Scouts with a broad range of disabilities. Over the next year and a half, the Birthplace will dramatically improve its physical and programmatic accessibility, developing new programming for Girl Scouts and public audiences on disability-related topics, and become a training hub for troop leaders throughout the state of Georgia who wish to better support girls with disabilities in their troops. This, to me, is a powerful way to honor Juliette Gordon Low's life story by extending her legacy to ensure her movement continues to thrive and be equally accessible to all girls. But this is just the beginning. There's so much work to be done. I'm moving into a speculative framework now. But I wonder if ultimately the answer to telling a complete story of Juliette's life and legacy is to challenge the very notion of a biographical approach. After all, Juliette Gordon Low's legacy is much greater than just the chronological story of her life. Her influence extends to the 50 million women whose lives have been transformed as a result of their participation in Girl Scouts. So perhaps we need a movement story. This is probably my favorite image of Juliette Low. Admittedly, you can barely see her in the middle. Look for the hat. And she's completely surrounded by girls at camp here in Savannah. This is the next generation who inherit the wealth of Juliette Gordon Low's legacy, as do Girl Scouts today. I realize it may sound contradictory, but for me, the best way to understand Juliette Gordon Low is to understand the story of the 50 million girls and women who followed her. Perhaps our job at the front door of the Girl Scout movement is to find ways to begin to tell that broader story. The Birthplace is currently preparing for a renovation that will help the site continue to uphold Juliette Gordon Low's legacy by bridging past and present. Additional exhibition spaces are just one of the exciting aspects of this project. And I wonder, could those hold rotating galleries of other girls and women in the movement who built on the foundation laid by Juliette Low? Could we create a StoryCorps booth for girls, troop leaders, and volunteers and community members to record how Girl Scouts has impacted their lives? Could girls themselves help to curate stories, perhaps for a digital exhibition that transcends the walls of the Birthplace, of a century of their peers who found a home in Girl Scouts? Those stories would build upon Juliette Gordon Low's personal story and transcend her own strengths and weaknesses. They would include, for example, women like Josephine Holloway, an African-American social worker who, in the 1920s, saw the benefits that Girl Scouts provided to white girls in her community. She worked to found a Girl Scout troop for black girls, and while the Nashville Girl Scouts Council first denied her request, she persisted. 18 years later, in 1942, the region's first official African-American Girl Scout troop was established. Eventually, Josephine Holloway was hired by Girl Scouts as a field advisor for black troops, reportedly serving more than 2,000 African-American girls and adults and ensuring that they had a welcome home within the organization. And stories of today's girls need to be told as well. One of my favorites is of a Southern California troop made up of girls who are the children of immigrants and refugees who recently hosted a Ramadan celebration and a welcome party for more than 100 refugees in their own community. Together, stories from Juliette Lowe's to Josephine Holloway to the girls in this troop from Southern California and many, many more could be woven together to tell the story of what it means to be a girl in the United States. And that's a big narrative, right? A single story will never do. I imagine that we could trace the interconnected threads of these stories and weave a tapestry that speaks to the power of women's relationships and leadership for over a century. This collective story would be stronger and more powerful than any one of the threads that it contains. Perhaps it would be strong enough to hold us up as we carry on the legacy of Juliette Gordon Low today. So I'd like to close by saying that one of our greatest honors is to pass on her legacy to a new generation of girls by sharing the local, national, international impact of her work. We're really happy to be here in the city of Savannah, and we hope that all of you will join us in helping to share the story and helping the birthplace to reflect the rich tapestry that Girl Scouts represents, a place that each girl in our movement can call home in her Girl Scout experience. There are lots of ways to get involved with what we're doing. You can follow us on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can check out our website. You can join the Circle of Friends, which is a group that supports the Birthplace's work to reach girls. And of course, you can feel free to stop by our home anytime. We're at 10 East Oglethorpe Avenue. So I'll close there, and I'm very happy to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you.
I was very interested in the StoryCorps idea because years ago, in preparation for the centennial, we actually had created a bank of oral histories from people that were coming into town for the events. And we did it through Mikveh Israel and through another organization, Morning Star. Currently, do you have access to those histories, or is that something that you haven't delved into yet?
That's a good question. To the ones that were recorded during the centennial? I don't know. I'd have to look for them. I haven't heard those stories, and I don't know where they reside. So they may be in the Birthplace collection. It's possible that they're at Girl Scout headquarters in New York. But given the partnerships involved, I don't know, do you all have access to those stories?
I have the 22-minute video that was the movie we created from the original oral histories, but I think we turned them over to the Girl Scout Council. So
to the council. So
yeah.
The council may be the entity that has them.
So you still really keep very separate the council from Birthplace?
Good question. So the Birthplace is owned by the national organization, GSUSA, and the council, we work very closely together, but the council is a separate nonprofit. They actually hold their own archive and collection. So as you're talking, it probably makes sense that it resides there. But that would be, a phone call for us to...
Maybe at first headquarters?
Yeah, likely at first headquarters. I'm so glad you mentioned this. I'd love to hear those stories. That's a great start.
We'll talk later.
Good. Jim?
Once the Girl Guide or the Girl Scouts were founded in 1912 got underway, was there a reaction from the Girl Guides in England to that, or was there a relationship between the two groups?
No, there was a strong relationship. In fact, Juliette, on some level, was challenged to take this model to the United States. So she continued to be close friends with Robert Baden-Powell and work closely together. And as I mentioned, after World War I, there was great interest in thinking internationally about what this organization could accomplish.
And how long did the Girl Guides last?
Still kicking. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Very strong in England. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes.
The Boy Scouts have had dwindling numbers, and they kind of recast themselves as a co-ed organization.
Mm-hmm.
But Girl Scouts is not thinking about that, is it?
No. Girl Scouts, I can say with all confidence that Girl Scouts is really committed to being an organization by and for girls. We see ourselves as the leaders in creating that safe environment for anyone who identifies as a girl. And we feel that it would not advance the needs of girls in order for us to open the organization to boys. Yeah. Hi.
Do you know where in Savannah that first black and white picture is with a small troop?
Well, we certainly have copies of it.
I mean,
Where it's
in Savannah
located.
It was taken. Yeah.
I bet my coworkers would be able to tell you because they're more seeped.
The location.
Yeah. They're more seeped into kind of early years of Girl Scouting. Does somebody know in this room, though? Maybe.
I know that they talked at first headquarters about some of the original pictures and such, and kind of across a side street from first headquarters. And that may be it.
Mm-hmm. Certainly a
Maybe
lot
that's
of...
a place to look.
Yeah. Certainly a lot of troop activities took place behind the Andrew Low House, right, at Girl Scouts' first headquarters.
Those girls been identified in that picture?
Some of them have, but I don't believe they all have. Mm-hmm.
Now, going back to what Carol said, at the Visual, we had a two-wall display. We also did a booklet that captured some of those stories. Mm-hmm. And, I mean, that's in my files.
Awesome. Yeah. Yeah, I'd
Maybe
love
we
to
need to
see.
share it again.
Let's talk. Let's talk. It's so interesting. The Girl Scout story, it's an international story, as I've posited, but it's also a Savannah story, right? And so many entities and individuals have a connection to this organization. It's really quite powerful. So, and I think part of our job at the Birthplace is to think about how to weave in, right, the kind of context of Savannah into the story of the early Girl Scouting movement.
It's kind of a loaded question. At any point did Juliette Gordon Low, in her lifetime, change her ideas about white supremacy? Mm-hmm. And I'm assuming that Girl Scouts were segregated because they had separate troops. At what point did they start to desegregate, and did they do any advocacy to end segregation?
Mm-hmm. It's an awesome question, and I could go on and on, but I'll try to be concise here. I would say that from our research, there's no evidence that Juliette Low's views changed during her lifetime. That said, by 1924, she was at a Girl Scout gathering. I believe Josephine Holloway was there, right? So African American women were participating in scouting. Juliette was participating in scouting. So there's that. But I think so as we look at historical figures, we often want them to have like that, that incredile moment, and perhaps, but again, we don't have evidence of that. Girl Scouting, this was Jim Crow South, so Girl Scouting was necessarily segregated in the very early years. But and I think, when you look at youth organizations overall, Luciana mentioned I used to work at Hull-House, which was a progressive settlement in Chicago that worked with immigrant families, communities. And there too, at the same period of time, you would see, the Greek Girls Club, the Italian Girls Club, there really was a kind of interest in separating. I'm not at all trying to kind of make an excuse or anything, but I think there's a lot of history to be considered about the way that these social clubs were formed and what was the value seen in kind of bolstering those identity groups. But you do, I would say that more research is needed, and sources are kind of mixed about when Girl Scouts began to integrate. However, by mid-century, the Girl Scouts organization nationally took a very strong stance in working to integrate troops, believing that this was good for the organization, good for the nation, and they really pushed out an agenda to council in order to encourage that. And I think have really been recognized in a number of ways kind of around the civil rights movement for their efforts. Any organization has, there are many threads, again, to look at, but at that point, there was a deep interest in ensuring that spaces were integrated that were Girl Scouts. And I should add that when the Birthplace was purchased by Girl Scouts in 1953, there was a lot of conversation about how it would be used by the national organization, and there was at least one contingent of folks who felt really strongly that that could be a critically important space to bring folks from different backgrounds together to have conversations about race and the civil rights movement. So there's really interesting ways that those interests kind of percolate back to the Savannah location. Yeah.
My question just kind of tied in with that. There, at one point, you said something about 1917 as a sort of making a little jump, but then the lady who started the black troop, the African American troop, that was kind of, she was trying to get that going in the 20s.
Later.
And but then finally was accepted in the 40s. But then for all that to happen in the 50s, I just wonder how other organizations followed. Like, but do you happen to know, like, for Boy Scouts, for instance, when did they start integrating or desegregating?
Yeah. Gosh, that's such an interesting question. I don't know the answer for Boy Scouts. I'd love to know.
I just wonder overall, because nationally even, that still seems to be a little bit ahead of laws that started making, like school stuff. Might have been about the same time frame. I can't remember on that well.
Yeah.
I just know I was born in 59. There was still a lot of segregation down here.
Yeah.
I was born here in Savannah, but I always went to school with everybody else. So I never actually went to a separate school.
Yeah.
By then we were integrated, at least physically.
Right.
I did sometimes I just wonder how I turned out so liberal, progressive, and the world that I kind of grew up in. This is just amazing to me. I don't know. I just feel super blessed that I was able to see things a little bit different than a lot of people did.
Yeah.
But it could have been because I was born with a disability also. And I was segregated off sometimes. Kids.
Yeah, I mean, to your first point, I think the timelines look different in different parts of the country. So that 1917 date that Girl Scouts has is for, I believe it's a troop in Massachusetts. And it's a newspaper article that states that there was an African-American troop. But, ultimately, I'd like to see some corroboration of that source. And, Tennessee was clearly a different story. And part of that is national politics and culture, and part of it is the fact that Girl Scouts is a federated model. So the way that the different councils operated varies sometimes, right, between different areas. But
It is interesting, the whole history and how, that we get to where we are right today. I give tours over to Sorrel Wheat House now, and we deal with the slavery issue big time, because we have slave boards there. And, the family, Francis Sorrel and all their welfare, as well as all of the other in Savannah, was pretty much based on slavery, and came from people having slaves. And one of the simplest ways of putting it sometimes is that they lived in a slave culture. Francis Sorrel lived through the slave rebellion in Haiti, but he still had slaves. And it was just, talking about it to kids sometimes when they come through there, you can tell everybody starts visiting when you start talking about slaves and slavery and everything. And I say, this is how we all got here together, y'all, today. And we're going to make the world better than this, or better than it was from here on. We're going to love each other, right? They always say right.
I think part of our job, anybody who's an educator, which is how I identify, I think when you get to the root of it, isn't it about, passing along tools to the next generation to make our world a better place, right? So that's why we've got to be talking about subjects like race, and that's why it's really heartening to see other historic sites, right? Owens Thomas House and others who are kind of actively taking on that conversation. I think it's really great.
Y'all's Carriage House, is that that's part of the new thing, right? That y'all are going to be doing all that?
Yeah, those are spaces that are used for educational programming and will continue to be that, as well as some visitor services. But we're really excited about the opportunity to make sure that our audiences can continue to enjoy this history, right? And that we can continue to provide the very best kind of service and interpretive programming for them.
I want to give Lisa another thank you for a wonderful talk. I also wanted to mention, if you haven't seen it, we do have an original piece of Juliette Gordon Low's artwork here across the hall in the chamber, and I'll ask Kelly if you'll go over and open up the chamber and turn on the lights. It's a bust of her grandfather, William Washington Gordon, who is a mayor of the city of Savannah, and she sculpted the bust in England, had it shipped back to Savannah, and it arrived here in 1926. And she got to see it one last time before she died, and then her brothers presented it to the city in 1927 because she had told them she wanted it here at City Hall. So if you'd like to see it, you can walk across the hall before you leave the building. But this was wonderful, and I really appreciate everybody coming out, and I hope to see you next month.